Late in the evening of April 21st, 1969, 24-year-old Secretary Sharon would left her workplace in Portland to attend a scheduled meeting with her husband, who wanted to discuss the details of their upcoming divorce. She descended to the basement parking garage where her car was parked. There, she was approached by a tall, stocky man. Later, she would tell the police that she instinctively felt someone behind her. She immediately oriented herself and planned to reach a spot where others could hear her cries. Just as she had this thought, the man tapped her on the shoulder and she turned around. The stranger held a gun. He advised her not to scream, but this sudden encounter both terrified and angered the young woman. She decided to fight back. Sharon screamed and stepped away from him, but the man grabbed her, wrapped his arms around her neck, and began to strangle her. He was much taller and weighed at least 50 kilograms more. Her chances of winning the fight were slim, but Sharon believed that if she didn't fight until someone heard the struggle, she would die that day. Her instincts told her what this man had in mind. Sharon kicked him with her high-heeled shoes and screamed again. She grabbed his gun and twisted it sharply. When the man tried to silence her by covering her mouth with his hand, she bit down on his palm with all her strength. She knew she had bitten deep enough to draw blood. He struggled to free himself but couldn't, and now he had to fight her instead. He grabbed her hair and tried to throw her to the ground, but Sharon resisted with all her might. She wasn't going to let him rape her. Even so, he managed to smash her head against the concrete floor, stunning her. She released his hand from her teeth. Then Sharon heard the sound of an approaching car. The attacker picked up his gun from the floor and fled. She remembered nothing after that. Apparently, someone called the police, and Sharon later gave her statement to officers. She recalled that the man was tall with blue eyes and freckles. She was sure she would recognize him if she saw him again. However, when the police questioned other residents in the area, no one could recall seeing a man matching that description. Much later, Sharon would learn that the man's failed attempt to assault her only made him adjust his approach to future attacks, forcing him to act more cautiously. Sharon would survive, but tragically, for many other women, encounters with this man would end in far worse outcomes. The next day, 15-year-old Gloria Jean Smith from Salem, Oregon, reported that a large, freckled man had tried to force her into a green Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. Both incidents appeared to be connected, but they provided no real leads. There were no witnesses in either case, and the freckled, blue-eyed man left no trace behind. At the time, investigators had no idea they were dealing with the case of a ruthless serial killer. The late 1960s were a tumultuous time for the United States. In 1968, the country was shaken by the assassination of presidential candidate Robert Kennedy, the defiance of the Chicago 7 during the Democratic National Convention, and violence on college campuses due to protests against the Vietnam War. A significant portion of the population was experimenting with drugs and occult practices. The nation was yet to witness the rise of more serial killers. In Boston, Albert DeSalvo, known as the Boston Strangler, was active. In Tucson, Charles Schmid, nicknamed the Pied Piper of Tucson, had been arrested for the murders of 3 girls. In Michigan, a series of murders claimed the lives of 8 students, while California witnessed the Manson family massacres and the Zodiac's reign of terror. But Oregon had yet to experience anything of that nature. It would take some time before investigators realized they were dealing with a serial killer. Even then, they couldn't fully comprehend the monstrous motives driving him. By the time they interrogated Sharon Wood, he was already responsible for the murders of 3 women. Linda Slauson worked for a book company. She went door to door convincing families to buy encyclopedia sets. She was only 19 years old. On January 26, 1968, her route took her to a neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. Some say she simply knocked on the wrong door. But in reality, no one knows what truly happened except for the story later recounted by the man she encountered. Linda Slauson was never seen again. The book company had no records of her exact location that day, leaving her family's desperate pleas to the police unanswered. Her abandoned car was found, but it provided no clues about her fate. There were no signs of struggle in the vehicle, and none of her personal belongings were missing. She had simply vanished. The search continued, but with each passing day, the chances of solving the case diminished. Moreover, police resources were stretched thin due to other serious incidents. If Linda had been kidnapped, the perpetrator was exceptionally careful, leaving no trace behind. The following year, Linda's case would resurface in investigators' minds as other young women began to disappear. On November 26, 1968, 23-year-old Jan Whitney vanished while driving home for Thanksgiving. Her Rambler was discovered on the highway near a rest area close to Albany, Oregon. The car was locked, but there was no sign of Jan nearby. It's likely her car broke down, and she decided to hitchhike for help. At that time, hitchhiking was common among young women traveling along the West Coast. Tragically, predators of all kinds quickly realized how easy it was to lure and kill them. No leads emerged in Jan's case. Like Linda Slauson, she simply disappeared without a trace. On March 27, 1969, 19-year-old Karen Sprinker went missing. She had been on her way home from college and was expected to meet her mother for lunch at a downtown restaurant. After waiting for an hour, her mother grew worried. Karen would never have missed their meeting. It was later discovered that Karen had parked her car in a department store lot, where her mother was waiting. But Karen never returned to retrieve it. Shoppers in the area reported seeing a very tall and peculiar woman nearby. One witness noted that upon closer inspection, the woman was actually a man in women's clothing. He appeared unnerving, and people avoided him. At the time, there was no reason to connect him to Karen's disappearance, but it would eventually come to light that he was involved in the mysterious vanishings of young women. Just 4 weeks later, 22-year-old Linda Sally was allegedly abducted from a shopping mall. She had been shopping for a gift for her boyfriend, but failed to meet him that evening. She also didn't show up for work, and her car was later found abandoned. As with the other cases, there were no signs of violence or struggle in the vehicle. Her boyfriend was initially considered a suspect, but was quickly cleared. Once again, a young woman had vanished without a trace. The police began to wonder if there was a connection between these missing women. Many officers were reminded of encyclopedia saleswoman Linda Slauson. They began charting timelines and noted a peculiar pattern. All the disappearances occurred closer to the latter half of each month. All of them were young white women, but that was all investigators had at the time. Things remained that way until human remains were discovered in a nearby river. 3 weeks had passed since Linda Sally disappeared. A man who went fishing at the Long Tom River in Oregon in May stumbled upon decomposing human remains drifting in the swift current. When the police arrived at the scene, they found that the deceased woman had been tied to a car transmission to weigh the body down, making it difficult to retrieve it from the water. However, the body provided clear evidence of murder and possible clues that could be linked to a specific suspect if the authorities managed to find one. It was revealed that the victim had been tied to the transmission with a nylon cord, uncommon for the time, copper wire, and a rather specific knot. Police carefully cut the cord to preserve the knot in case it could be used later as probable cause for a warrant or as evidence in court. The copper wire was also twisted in a particular way, suggesting the suspect might have had experience as an electrician. The coroner understood that determining the exact cause of death would be challenging given the limited initial data, but based on marks on the neck, it was concluded that the victim had been strangled. The body also showed a couple of strange post-mortem punctures, each surrounded by burns. Both were located on the chest and appeared to have been made with a needle. Dental records identified the remains as those of the missing Linda Sally. Investigators continued to search along the river and, a few days later, came across another set of decomposing remains. These, too, had been tied to a car part, which was later identified as an engine. This victim had been bound with the same type of cord and knots, providing strong evidence that the same person was responsible for both crimes. This victim had also been strangled, likely with a belt. Fragments of clothing still on the body matched the description given by Karen Sprinker's mother. However, when police retrieved the body from the water, they discovered the victim was also wearing a long black bra that was too large for her. This was confirmed by her mother, and it had been padded with brown paper towels. It turned out that this victim's breasts had been removed, and sanitary pads had been placed over the horrific wounds to absorb blood and fluids. Some speculated that the killer wanted to create the appearance of large breasts, but these theories remained unproven at the time. Further searches along the river yielded no additional evidence, although investigators continued to hope that these efforts might help close the cases of 2 other missing women. They knew they needed to look for either a physically strong man or 2 men working together, as carrying the bodies along with the weights would have been quite challenging for one person. Given Karen Sprinker's past, the police decided to interview students at Oregon State University in Corvallis, a move that proved to be wise. Detectives speaking with students learned that some female students had recently complained about strange phone calls from a man trying to lure them in. There were also reports of a suspicious red-haired, slightly overweight man who was often seen loitering around the campus. Detectives interviewed a young woman who had gone on a brief date with this man, who introduced himself as a lonely Vietnam veteran looking for company. This sounded promising. The woman had no intention of meeting him again, as she found him a bit odd. She also recalled that he had brought up the bodies found in the river during their conversation. Detectives asked her to inform the police if he contacted her again. This man also asked her why she wasn't afraid to meet strangers like that. For example, they could strangle her. The detectives considered these questions to be abnormal curiosity. Additionally, her description of a tall man with light hair and a lot of freckles resembled the descriptions of women who had nearly been kidnapped in recent days. The detectives were eager to believe that this man would contact the woman again. To her surprise, he did exactly that, and the girl arranged a meeting in an hour, then called the police. The detectives went to the appointed meeting place and noticed a tall, plump man. Approaching him, they learned that his name was Jerry Brudos. Although they considered him a suspect, he behaved completely casually, as if he had nothing to hide. This meant that he was either truly innocent or very smart, arrogant, and did not feel any moral guilt for what he was doing. The police had no grounds to detain him, but they kept him under surveillance. After discovering where he lived and an interesting fact that he worked as an electrician, the detectives began studying his biography. Jerome Henry Brudos was born on January 31st, 1939. His parents traveled a bit around the country searching for the best place to settle, and eventually moved to Oregon. It is likely that the boy was not a desired child for his mother, as she already had a son. Therefore, she treated little Jerome with criticism and disdain. The woman wanted a girl, and if Jerry had understood this, it might have affected his development and self-esteem. In contrast, she adored her older son Larry. Jerry was an unremarkable and sickly child, with few friends. He often complained about sore throats and migraines. At school, he received average grades, unlike his academically successful and popular brother. In high school, Brudos remained unremarkable to both his peers and teachers. He rarely participated in extracurricular activities, although it is known that in his early teenage years, he was the secretary-treasurer of a youth club. Due to the lack of maternal affection and love, he became attached to other women who were not like his mother. As a child, he became very close to one girl, but she died, which also left an indelible mark on his soul. Often being alone, he invented a life and habits for himself that he did not have. Because of this, by the age of 17, Jerome was in trouble with the law. They were usually related to a sexual fetish for women's shoes and underwear. How exactly Brudos became a foot fetishist remains a mystery. However, one thing is certain. He began to manifest this obsession at an astonishingly early age. The starting point was his discovery of a pair of women's stiletto heels with rhinestone clasps at a local dump when he was 5 years old. It probably wasn't because of the shoes themselves, though. Rather, it was most likely the strong reaction of his mother, who saw him wearing those shoes in his bedroom. The mother became furious and yelled at the boy, beat him up, and burned the shoes she found in Jerry's presence. She was very agitated and inexplicably upset, causing Jerome to become convinced that there was something appealingly forbidden about those shoes. It is likely that this prohibition created an aura around women's high-heeled shoes that permeated Brudos' developing sexuality. He also stole his kindergarten teacher's shoes that she kept in her desk, for which he was reprimanded. He later recalled his attraction to women's shoes and women's feet stemming from an incident when, at the age of about 5, he watched the teenage daughter of a family friend sleep on his bed. As he grew older, his shoe fetish became increasingly sexually arousing. Psychologists who later analyzed his behavior were inclined to agree. Brudos continued to secretly collect shoes, hiding them from his mother, and eventually began to add to his stash of collections of women's underwear, which he stole during clandestine raids on nearby homes. Touching women's underwear gave him a certain sense of comfort and a sense of arousal. They were mysterious and forbidden totems that aroused deep erotic feelings in him that he could neither understand nor explain. However, the boy was very shy to socialize with his female peers. Moreover, his height and severe acne further reduced his confidence in his ability to please girls. By 1953, Grols had begun masturbating. He later claimed that as a teenager, he never had an oubliette during masturbation, although he often experienced policizations. Whenever his mother discovered semen stains on his bedsheets, the boy was punished and forced to do laundry, just not himself. When he turned 17 in 1956, Fetish Jerry dug a hole in a hillside to keep girls in it as sex slaves. In April of that year, Brudos persuaded a 17-year-old girl to go on a date with him. Taking her out on a deserted road, he ordered her to undress so that Jerome could take pictures of her naked body. The girl refused, whereupon Brudos dragged her out of the car and began beating her, resulting in a broken nose. The girl's screams attracted the attention of a passing motorist who stopped and intervened in the conflict. Brudos unconvincingly claimed that the girl had fallen out of the car and immediately changed his story, claiming that the hysterical girl had been attacked by some weirdo he had overpowered. His story was not believed, and the couple drove the two of them to the nearest police station, where Jerome admitted to assaulting the girl, but claimed his intention was simply to intimidate her into taking off her clothes so he could take her picture. Jerry denied ever having engaged in such actions before and insisted that his temper simply got the best of him. Brudos was arrested on charges of assault and battery. A subsequent search of Brudos' bedroom uncovered his extensive collection of women's clothing, as well as numerous Polaroid photographs of teenage girls. One of the girls was identified. She was contacted, and she shared details about Jerry's actions in August of the previous year. Brudos was taken into custody and transferred to the juvenile department. For this crime, he served 9 months in the psychiatric ward of the Oregon State Hospital. During his confinement, he was able to attend school. While in the facility, Jerome Brudos underwent several evaluations, which revealed that he was a depressed individual suffering from schizotypal personality disorder, but did not have a severe mental illness or delusions. During therapy, doctors learned that his sexual fantasies were centered around hatred for his demanding mother and revenge against women in general. They were also aware of his collection of women's clothing. Jerry's fantasies included placing kidnapped girls in a freezer so that later he could position their frozen bodies in overtly sexual poses. The psychiatric report issued about him stated that the examining psychiatric staff did not consider Brudos to be severely mentally ill. He was diagnosed with borderline schizophrenia. In his teenage years, he began his transitional period, which led them to not consider him dangerous, although Jerome developed a fetish for women's shoes and underwear, as well as for photographs of naked women. He seemed immature and incapable of properly handling his developing sexuality. But this did not seem to anyone to be the foundation of violence. Doctors believed the young man would grow up and it would all pass. It's unlikely they can be blamed for this misconception, as in 1956 there was practically no knowledge about sexual maniacs. In March 1957, Brudos joined the Army, where he trained as a communications technician. Although he became a highly skilled professional in this field, his military service was generally uneventful. In October of that same year, he was discharged early due to strange delusional states, or according to other reports, due to obsessive sexual ideas. It is known that he earned a reputation among his fellow soldiers as a fantasist who repeatedly claimed he had casual sexual relations with a beautiful Korean girl who would sneak into his bed every night. Brudos returned to his parents' home in Oregon, where he got a job as an electronics engineer at a local radio station. Colleagues considered Jerry to be an outstanding, experienced, and conscientious employee who had a gentle manner, but lacked ambition for career advancement, despite being a licensed technical specialist in the field of broadcasting, which was gaining momentum at that time. For several years, while Brudos lived with his parents, his mother allowed him to sleep in the second bedroom while his older brother was away at college. However, when his brother graduated and returned, Jerry was forced to sleep in a shed at the back of the house. In 1961, when he was 22 years old, he met a shy 17-year-old girl named Ralphina Schwindler. The young people were brought together by a teenager who, being an electronics enthusiast, often visited the radio station where Jerry worked to ask him about his job. One day, as a joke, this teenager noted Brudos' shyness toward female employees. He jokingly suggested that he get a girlfriend, and to his surprise, Brudos agreed. The teen took Jerry to the Schwindler house. On September 30th, 1961, Brudos and Schwindler, who at that time was in the first month of pregnancy, married. The newlyweds lived in Portlandia at first, but moved to a small house in Salem Parish in the summer of 1968. 2 children were born to their marriage, a daughter, Teresa, and a son, Brian. To supplement the family income, Brudos occasionally repaired cars in the family garage. Brudos never physically or emotionally abused his wife, although in the early years of their marriage he insisted that she walk around the house and perform household chores in nude only. At home, she was allowed to wear as many high-heeled shoes. Before having sex, Brudos often took nude photos of his wife. The wife was forbidden to enter her husband's workshop and attic. For several years, Ralphina acquiesced to such tendencies of her spouse, and Jerry Brudos is known not to have committed any crimes in the early years of their marriage. By the mid-1960s, eldest daughter Teresa began to demand more physical attention and care from her mother. Therefore, Ralphina began refusing to walk around the house naked and in high heels. In addition, Jerome began to gain weight. Ralphina later stated that although she never reported this to her husband, his appearance began to repel her. Although Ralphina remained faithful to Jerome, they had less and less sexual intercourse. His wife devoted more time to her daughter and social activities with her friends, and Browd meanwhile spent more and more time either at work or in his workshop, where he was engaged in various electronics projects. In May 1967, while his wife was giving birth to their second child in the hospital, Jerome discreetly followed a young woman in beautiful high-heeled shoes to her home. He waited until darkness fell, Then he entered her apartment and began to strangle the woman until she lost consciousness. Brudos later claimed that his original intentions did not include rape, but the sight of the young, attractive woman lying helplessly and under his control aroused him to such an extent that he raped her unconscious body and then fled the scene, taking her high-heeled shoes with him. Rolfina did not notice how her husband would leave at night and intrude into other people's homes to satisfy his lingerie fetish, although she did feel some oddities in his behavior. One day, he approached her dressed in women's underwear. His wife was shocked, and Jerry was offended by her inability to understand his actions. He sought a woman who would submit to his will and accept all of his fantasies. Rolfina disappointed him, and he returned to his secret world. On another occasion, Rolfina discovered a paperweight in the shape of a woman's breast in the house. This fact greatly troubled her, but Brudos had his explanation. Not knowing what else to do, she accepted it and forgot about the incident, just as she had when she caught him developing photographs of naked women. The following year, Brudos was arrested by the police at a women's dormitory at a university, charged with stealing women's clothing, and at the time of his arrest, he was wearing high-heeled shoes and women's underwear. Several mass and serial killers, such as Jerry Brudos, claimed they were made to dress as girls when they were children, but unlike him, most of them did not become transvestites, while some became transvestites without any influence from their parents. Dr. Lynn Fraser, a therapist from San Francisco who worked with clients, proposed a detailed discussion of the phenomenon of cross-dressing based on her experience with her clients during a conference in 1990. She highlighted a system of classification of male transsexualism that would help interested parties understand this unusual, multifaceted world. Cross-gender identity with early onset, where there is no sexual arousal related to dressing in the clothing of the opposite sex. Effeminate homosexuality, manifested in those who are talkative and uninhibited in sex. Late-onset cross-dressing. Dressing is linked to sexuality and is triggered by specific things, as the feminine orientation gradually begins to dominate over the masculine. Cross-dressing without transsexualism. Cross-dressing as an escape mechanism without the desire to change gender identity. Jerome Brudos belonged to the latter category. Dr. Fraser does not address the erotic nature of fantasy, but it is evident that underwear and shoes aroused Brudos. As he became bolder in acquiring and wearing these items, he took advantage of his ability to sneak unnoticed into women's bedrooms. One day, he attacked a sleeping woman and raped her. She reported it to the police, but no one pursued the case. They believed the woman was at fault and had provoked the man intentionally. Notably, when Jerome was arrested, the police discovered that Brudos had previously been involved in physical and sexual violence against women, but they still let him go. Additionally, it turned out that he had given a false address. A search of vehicle records showed that Jerry lived in the same area of Portland where Linda Slowson was last seen. Upon discovering Brudos' actual address, investigators found that he was currently living only a few blocks away from the department store where Karen Springer had been abducted. Furthermore, although Brudos did not drive a Volkswagen Karmann Ghia, investigators discovered that such a car belonged to his mother, and that he was indeed driving it on April 22nd, the day of the attempted abduction of Gloria Smith. Smith herself positively identified Brudos as the person who had tried to abduct her. This information was considered a sufficiently probable cause to obtain a search warrant for Brudos' property. The police also obtained a search warrant for Brudos' car, but found that the interior had been meticulously cleaned. Although this looked suspicious, it was not illegal, and Brudos had a ready explanation for this. However, he had no rebuttal to the words of the woman who selected him in a photo lineup as the man who had recently tried to force her into his car. Her identification of him was enough to justify his arrest and the charges of possession of a weapon in his car. Detectives hoped for more solid evidence, but there were concerns that Brudos might panic and shut down. 5 days later, on May 18, 1969, when the coincidences with the wanted criminal became too numerous, Brudos was arrested again. By May 29, 1969, investigators had gathered enough evidence in the attempted abduction of Gloria Smith to arrest Brudos for that crime. While the murder investigation continued, Jerome was found by highway patrol officers hiding under a blanket in the back of his station wagon while his wife, Rolfina, was driving the car towards Portland. The following evening, Brudos called his wife and asked her to destroy some compromising evidence, but she refused his request. After the second arrest, Brudos was thoroughly interrogated about the events related to the items found in his garage and his connections to the missing and murdered young women, 3 of whom investigators had positively identified as Whitney, Springer, and Sally. Initially, he denied any involvement in these cases, dismissing the evidence as circumstantial, But after a few days, he gradually began to talk about his erotic fetishes and emphasized how deeply they were rooted in his psyche and later became serious. After Brudos was arrested, it was discovered that he was wearing women's panties. Despite warnings from his lawyer to remain silent, Brudos began to speak. He revealed that when he was 28, he met Linda Slauson. She became his first victim, and only after he confessed to the police about what he had done did his sick fantasies fully come to light. Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho. It is a black and white film based on the story of Ed Gein, depicting a mad recluse whose personality is dominated by his mother. The young man appears presentable, but harbors a desire to fatally stab a woman who sexually arouses him. Essentially, he kills the unacceptable part of himself. His condition of multiple personality disorder shocked the nation, especially with its eerie intergender manifestations. In the case of Jerry Brudos, the police were about to witness something similar, only without any mental illness. By June 1969, Brudos had provided investigators with a full confession to all 4 murders, which he later relayed to the police and psychologists. He began by describing the opportunistic murder of Linda Slauson, a name he could not remember, which was unrelated to him and, by his admission, was primarily provoked by the attractive high-heeled shoes the young woman was wearing when she knocked on his door to sell encyclopedias. The girl, who naively followed him into the workshop to show her encyclopedias, received a blow strong enough to knock her unconscious. He then strangled her. His wife and children were at home at the time. Even though the dead girl was lying on the workshop floor, he entered the living room, had calm conversations with his family, and invited them all to go somewhere for lunch. From January 1968 to April 1969, Jerry Brudos killed 4 women. Some newspaper reports indicate that there were 5 victims, but the 5th incident did not align with Brudos' pattern, and during interrogation, he denied knowing the victim. Jerry also attempted to kill several other people. Much of what is known about his encounters with these victims comes from his own confessions, which he voluntarily gave over 3 days. Detectives who interrogated him noted his complete lack of guilt and remorse, although he mourned his fate and sympathized with his wife and children. It was also noted that he never lost his appetite and happily ate prison food, despite how grotesque his descriptions of his tortures were. Brudos confessed that he killed and mutilated 4 women, threw their bodies into a river after cutting off pieces from them. His first victim, Linda Slauson, was missing her left foot, and after he got rid of the rest of the body, he kept that foot for a while, trying on shoes on it and taking pictures of it. For the other 2, he removed their breasts. He also photographed them while the girls were in his power and had sex with their bodies. All of Brudos' victims were abducted and murdered for one purpose: to satisfy his need to dominate and possess attractive young women and to satisfy his sexual fetishes. After the act of murder, each victim was subjected to a ritual of dressing in various undergarments and shoes, during which Brudos would position the body in provocative poses, then photograph them and masturbate them, often beginning by caressing the victim's feet and ankles. Each victim was also subjected to acts of necrophilia, and 3 of them were mutilated after death. Brudos kept the severed body parts to feed his fetishes and to express his dominance. He subsequently dumped all the body parts in the Willamette River. However, he kept the victim's shoes and underwear to the last and stored them in the garage, where he strictly forbade his wife and children from entering without prior notice via a specially installed intercom. After the arrest, details of each victim's murder emerged. Brudos' first murder contradicted the conventional wisdom that killers often dispose of the body or leave the scene as quickly as possible. Later, as they become accustomed to the corpses, they begin to perform more acts with them. But with his first experience, Brudos was apparently quite satisfied. Immediately, with the dead girl in his arms, he began to think about what he could do with her, now that he had the real thing in his hands. Not just his obsessive fantasies. His personal images have acquired enough complexity to prepare him to spend some time with a victim and realize all the things he had previously only dreamed of. Encyclopedia saleswoman Linda Catherine Slauson, Jeremy Brudos encountered when he was working in his workshop on January 26, 1968. She mistakenly walked into his yard. Mistaking his address, the girl believed she had an appointment with the landlord about buying an encyclopedia. Upon hearing the reason for the visit, Brudos feigned interest in purchasing a set of encyclopedias to lure the girl into the basement of his home. He sent his wife and children out to eat, and then when a friend arrived unexpectedly, Brudos had to spend some time escorting him out. When the girl sat on a stool and began to advertise, Brudos hit her on the head with a piece of wood, then strangled her with his hands, after which he hid the body under the basement stairs. He then ordered his wife to remove the children from the house, allegedly to buy hamburgers, after which he began engaging in necrophilia with Linda's body. He remembered with precision all the circumstances of the girl's murder and all the subsequent actions. Having undressed the body of the young woman, Brudos discovered that Naslausen was wearing rather racy red underwear. This situation prompted him to pull out a box of previously picked up women's underwear and shoes and began dressing the body in different outfits, carrying the corpse each time and photographing much of the process. A few hours later, Brudos sawed off the girl's left leg with a hacksaw. The maniac placed the foot in a freezer located in the basement. This foot he planned to use as a mannequin, both for his extensive collection of high-heeled shoes and to fuel his fantasies during acts of masturbation. He had so many stiletto shoes that he would spend hours trying them on that severed foot and taking pictures. He also kept a memento of the 2 encyclopedias that Linda Slauson had hoped to sell him a heavy cylinder head and dumped it in Marion County. He was never able to recall the exact location of the body. As Brudos told his story, detectives were disturbed by the way he became increasingly arrogant as he described his horrific actions. It was as if he viewed the women he killed and mutilated only as objects that belonged to him and existed solely for his pleasure. No matter what he was doing, it didn't matter to him. What mattered to him was his own pleasure. And since he desperately needed that intoxicating sensation, he soon had to look for a new victim. He met 23-year-old Jen Susan Whitney Brudos when he was returning home from work on November 26, 1968. Later, Brudos insisted that this murder, like the murder of Slauson, was committed out of necessity. He didn't want to kill, but he had to when he noticed 3 people, a girl and 2 men, standing near a broken rambler next to the State Highway 5 between Salem and Albany. After inspecting Whitney's car, Brudos claimed that he could fix it but would have to go home to get the necessary tools. The girl was supposedly supposed to go with him. Whitney and her hitchhiking companions, whom she had picked up earlier, agreed to go with Brudos as long as he promised to drop the men off at their destination first. The 2 hitchhikers sat in the back seat of Jerome's car, while Whitney sat beside the driver. After dropping off the hitchhikers at their destination, Brudos drove Whitney to his house. He then went inside, leaving the car in the driveway. Supposedly, to get the necessary tools to repair Whitney's car, Brudos returned, climbed into the back seat of the car, asked the girl to close her eyes, and posed a riddle. How could one tie a shoelace without opening their eyes and without moving their hands? Whitney thought about the solution, after which Brudos pounced on her and tightened a leather belt around her neck. He then raped her lifeless body inside the car. Afterward, Brudos took the girl's body to his workshop, where he began trying on various shoes and lingerie, performing acts of necrophilia with each change of clothing while continuing to photograph the entire process with his Polaroid camera. Whitney's body hung for 2 days from the ceiling of the workshop, and Brudos confessed to having raped it every time he felt the need. Jerry Brudos cut off one of the breasts to use it as a paperweight. But he later abandoned the idea when he noticed that the epoxy resin hardener hadn't fully set. Instead, Brudos stuffed the breast with sawdust and then attached it to a wooden board. According to Brudos, 2 days after Whitney's murder, a car crashed into his garage, breaking a hole in the wall. After removing the body, which by this time must have started to decompose, he invited the police to come and inspect the damage from the crash. Apparently, they didn't feel anything, even though the body was wrapped in plastic film in another building in the yard. That same evening, Brudos decided to dispose of the girl's body to avoid tempting fate further. He tied her body to a piece of railroad track and threw it into the Willamette River along with the severed leg of Lindy Slauson, which by that time had already started to decompose. He refused to specify the exact location of the body. Strangely enough, he told the police so much that he concealed key details, as though he thought keeping some things secret would prevent them from holding him accountable. Although this deprived the police of the chance to find the body, they had enough other evidence to charge Jerry. Karen Elena Springer was an 18-year-old chemistry student at Oregon State University. On March 27, 1969, Brudos abducted her at gunpoint from the parking lot near the Mayers and Frank department store when she was on her way to lunch with her mother. At the time of the abduction, Brudos, dressed in women's clothing, decisively drove his van into the parking lot, saw the young woman in high-heeled shoes and a miniskirt, parked the vehicle, and attempted to follow her on foot but soon lost sight of her. On his way back to his car, he noticed Karen getting out of her car and heading towards the department store. Under the threat of a gun, he forced her to get into his car and took her to his house. Brudos didn't beat or torture the girl. Springer repeatedly begged him not to harm her, and when she ended up in his workshop, she said she would do whatever he wanted as long as the abductor wouldn't kill her. In response, Brudos asked if she was a virgin. Springer answered affirmatively, adding that she had started her period. Brudos then forced her to undress and began raping Karen right on the workshop floor. Afterward, he made Springer pose in various high-heeled shoes and lingerie while Brudos photographed her. Then Jerry Brudos tied the girl's hands behind her back and threw a rope around her neck. Afterward, he asked if the rope was too tight. Karen replied that it was too much. So he threw the rope over the ceiling beam of the workshop and started pulling her. The girl's legs came off the floor. She began to convulse and died a short time later. Over the next few hours, Brudos repeatedly committed acts of necrophilia with Springer's body. He also cut off both of her breasts to mold the organs into plastic casts. He dressed the corpse in a bra that was clearly too big and stuffed it with rags instead of breasts. That same evening, he tied Tara Karen Springer to a 6-cylinder engine and threw her into the Willamette River. In April 1969, Brudos, tormented by his fantasies, tried to kidnap two girls, 24-year-old Sharon Wood and 15-year-old Gloria Jan Smith, for several days in a row. They both managed to escape from the maniac, and both reported the attack to the police. Thanks to this, the police obtained a description of the attacker's appearance and compared his actions with previous kidnappings. Jerome Brudos' most recent victim was 22-year-old Linda Dawn Sally. Sally was a student at Portland State University and worked part-time as a secretary at a local firm. Brudos kidnapped her on the grounds of the Lloyd Center Mall late in the evening of April 23, 1969. Here the girl was buying a pair of pants, a watch band as a birthday present for her fiancé, and was returning to her car when she was approached by Brudos, who tricked her into believing he was a police officer by showing her a fake police badge and informing the girl that she had been arrested for shoplifting. Although Sally suspected something amiss and claimed innocence, she agreed to walk with Brudos to his automobile. There he grabbed the girl and informed her that he was kidnapping her for ransom. Brudos then drove to his house. He parked in the garage and ordered Sally to follow him across the yard to the house, believing that his wife and children were visiting relatives. At this point, his wife appeared on the porch and announced that she had prepared a family dinner. In response, Brudos, who was about 10 feet away from the porch, signaled Sally to stand still. He informed his wife, Ralphina, that he would be at the house in a few minutes. He took Sally to the garage and tied her up with a rope. Jerry then went home to have dinner with his family. After dinner, Brudos discovered that Sally had freed herself from her restraints but made no further attempt to escape. She tried to resist his immediate attempts to put the leather belt around her neck and knock her down. The girl relentlessly asked the question, "Why are you doing this to me?" Then Sally began to scratch and kick Brudos, and he threw her to the floor again and again, lifting her up by the leather belt. After a while, the girl lost consciousness. Brudos then finally strangled Sally and raped her lifeless body. He then suspended Sally's body by the neck from the ceiling of the workshop, as he had done on the previous 2 occasions. He inserted hypodermic needles into her rib cage under each armpit. He connected an electric current to the needles in an attempt to revitalize the girl's body. Jerry figured that the body would at least start twitching and writhing under the current, but nothing of the sort happened. Only the places where the needles entered the girl's body were blackened. He held Sally's body in that position for 24 hours, raping it periodically. He then tied the tubes to the gearbox and threw it into the Willamette River. Although Brudos created a mold of Sally's breasts, he did not mutilate that part of the girl's body as he had done with previous victims because he believed that Sally's nipple eagles were too pink. When Brudos confessed to his crimes and provided details, it was obvious that he took great pleasure in describing his fetish for shoes, panties, and bras. He became even more aroused as he described these things, as if his passion could become contagious and infect the officers sitting with him in the interrogation room. Although Brudos acknowledged full responsibility for his crimes, he continued to resist when asked about aspects of planning and premeditation, simply stating at one point, "There must be something wrong with me." He denied his hatred for women, but admitted that the murders allowed him to release his anger. Psychologists who examined Brudos concluded that he could not derive satisfaction from normal sexual activity. They also concluded that the primary motive for his crimes was lust. They added that even in cases where Brudos killed women he encountered opportunistically, he knew that he would ultimately kill his victim. On June 2, 1969, as reported by local newspapers, Brudos was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Karen Springer, and the police obtained a search warrant. Brudos believed he had removed the evidence from his workshop, ordering his wife to burn the stock of women's clothing. However, he didn't smile for long. Ralphina refused to comply with his orders. A team of forensic experts entered Brudos' house and workshop to find items that could link him to one or more victims, as well as to learn more about his modus operandi. What they discovered there shocked them. Investigators photographed everything, including the hook and pulley on the ceiling used to lift the bodies. They found nylon rope and a leather belt that could have been used in the murders. From a shelf, they removed a mold made of grotesque papier-mâché, which, according to Brudos, depicted a woman's breast. The forensic team also discovered a hidden stash of women's shoes in various sizes and a multitude of items of lingerie, bras, belts, panties, and slippers, as well as a collection of Polaroid photographs. Some of the photos showed Brudos himself wearing women's underwear, but the most significant ones captured his victims. They found a woman hanging from the ceiling with a black hood over her head. Another body was dressed in various pieces of clothing and photographed in different poses. Quite often, Brudos would cut out the heads from the photographs to enjoy an anonymous female form. The photograph that truly caught the attention of the forensic investigators sealed the case against this monstrous killer, even in the minds of his own attorneys. The body of a woman, dressed in a black lace negligee and garter belt, hung from the ceiling. A camera, aimed at her groin, was reflected in a mirror on the floor. In the lower corner of the photograph was a frozen image of the killer, reflected in the mirror. It was Brudos, staring at the woman he had just murdered. Now, the police had solid physical evidence against him. They also confirmed details of the rape from a surviving victim who Brudos had confessed to, although this woman was unable to identify her attacker. In that incident, she had lost several pairs of shoes and underwear. The police also discovered a spool of copper wire, identical to the kind used to tie the bodies of Linda Sally and Karen Springer, as well as engine parts before they were thrown into the Willamette River. A length of rope seized by investigators was tied in exactly the same way as the victims' bodies. Additionally, the garage contained numerous engine parts. These findings were deemed sufficient to place Brudos under constant surveillance. On June 4, 1969, Jerome Brudos was charged with additional offenses. After consulting with his attorneys, who saw no other option, on June 27, 1969, Brudos changed his plea to guilty for the murders of Jen Whitney, Karen Springer, and Linda Sally. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms with the possibility of parole. He also confessed to a 4th murder, but the body of Linda Slauson was never found, and he was not charged in connection with that case. Brudos' wife, Rolfina, was then arrested and tried as his accomplice. A neighbor claimed to have seen Rolfina assisting Brudos with one of the victims, but her testimony was later disproven. Since there was no evidence that Rolfina knew about or participated in any of her husband's crimes, it was hard to believe that she was acquitted. However, in October 1969, all charges against her were dropped. In 1970, she divorced Brudos, changed her name, and moved with her children to an undisclosed location. In August 1970, the Oregon Court of Appeals issued a ruling on Brudos' motion for a rehearing. Brudos argued that the court should not have accepted his guilty plea for the 3 first-degree murders and, therefore, should not have imposed consecutive life sentences. Brudos' attorney claimed that when a person receives a life sentence for a crime, any subsequent life sentences should be served concurrently with the first sentence. The court responded that it could not consider the defendant's initial claim of error during a direct appeal. Instead, the defendant should have provided grounds for overturning his guilty plea within the appropriate legal framework. As a result, Brudos' appeal was entirely denied, as were all subsequent appeals, including one in which he argued that he had been suffering from hypoglycemia when he confessed. Brudos continued to periodically file petitions for parole, which consistently resulted in a flood of letters from Oregon residents to the parole board, urging them to prevent the criminal from being released. Brudos insisted that he no longer posed a threat to society and even claimed that he had not committed the murders. He also attempted to minimize his crimes by blaming his mother for abuse and neglect. In his appeals to the board, Brudos mentioned that he had had mental health issues during his criminal activities and stated that at the time, the world seemed less real to him. In 1995, the parole board voted to keep him incarcerated for life. Nevertheless, Brudos continued to file petitions every 2 years, hoping that one day he would be released. However, he never showed any remorse. Jerome Brudos became a model prisoner. He was allowed to move around the prison without supervision. After obtaining clerical duties in the 1970s, he later used his electronic skills to maintain the prison's computer database system and set up a cable TV network. He was also tasked with stocking, repairing, and maintaining the prison's vending machines. He was even allowed to make leather keychains engraved with names and sell them through the prison store. Brudos was also permitted to order catalogs featuring images of women wearing high heels and lingerie. He used this material to fuel his erotic and masturbatory fantasies. As a convicted sex offender, Jerry Brudos endured several physical assaults from fellow inmates, although in each case, he refused to identify the attackers. While in prison, Brudos gave interviews to various people from different professions. One of these people was former Marion County Detective Jim Burns, who later recalled a conversation between him and Brudos about compassion and remorse, during which he asked, "Do you feel any remorse, Jerry? Do you feel sorry for your victims?" In response, Brudos took a piece of paper from the table, crumpled it up, threw it on the floor, and said, "Here is my compassion." Psychiatrist Michael Stone described Brudos as a psychopathic personality, noting his heartlessness and lack of remorse for his crimes. Brudos died of liver cancer while incarcerated at the Oregon State Prison at 5:10 a.m. on March 28, 2006. He was 67 years old at the time of his death and was the longest-serving inmate in the Oregon Department of Corrections.